Okay, I want to go ahead and get started here. This is the second part of the right triangle trigonometry series of videos that I have. Part 2, we're going to be solving for the side lengths of a right triangle. Part 3, we solve for the angles of a right triangle. These are 5 steps. Your 5 steps, if you follow these 5 steps, this is it's going to get you to the correct solution. First step, label the hypotenuse. You always know the hypotenuse is across from the right angle. And we talked about labeling the sides as opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse in the first video. It was in the first video, so label the hypotenuse. After you have labeled the hypotenuse, you have to identify the angle that you will be using in your calculation, or the angle that you need to find. Step number 3, from that angle, you label the opposite side and the adjacent side. And remember, it is important that you use the angle that you are going to be using in your calculations, because as in the first video, we described that the opposite side and adjacent sides, they depend on which angle you're using. Number 4 is determine which trig ratio you will be using. You're going to either use sine, cosine, or tangent, and you should have those formulas from the first video. And from that first video, you have those formulas. You should know how to, actually you don't know how to calculate or set up the fraction, but you have the formulas. So as long as you got those formulas, then you're good to go. And we're going to show you how to use those in this video right now. And then now it's just substitute. You guys have been substituting since probably middle school. So substitute the values into the trig ratio and solve. And these are the 5 steps that we're going to be doing. So if you can follow those 5 steps, you should be okay there. Let's go ahead and get started. This is solve the triangle, find all side lengths and angle measures. Well, if we look right there, we do have one angle of 57 degrees, and we have one side length of 15. So, step number 1 said label the hypotenuse. Label the hypotenuse. This is across from the right angle. So there's the hypotenuse. Step 2, determine the angle that you're using. We're going to be using 57 degrees. We could use this angle down here if we did have it calculated, but we don't have it calculated, so we're not using it. But we will have to calculate it because it does tell us to find the angle measures, but we're going to do that last. So we're going to use 57 degrees. So from the last video, theta is equal to 57 degrees. Now we need to label opposite and adjacent side. So the opposite side is across from 57. And the adjacent side is right next to 57. Right next to it, that is not the hypotenuse. So this is where we're at. Okie dokie. So now we need to figure out what we want to find. What do you want to calculate? Well, if we need to find all side lengths. Well, first off, it doesn't matter what you find. If you find the opposite side or the hypotenuse, I'm just going to go ahead and, first off, we're going to find the hypotenuse. So now we're on step 4, and it says determine which trig ratio we're going to be using. So let's determine which trig ratio we're going to be using. Here's some notes. Just pay attention to this. We need to find the hypotenuse. We know the adjacent side. Okay, the hypotenuse, we're going to label it. We can just label it. I don't want to label it H. Let's just label it X. So we're going to put an X there, and we'll label the opposite side as Y. So back to what we have here. Hypotenuse is X. The adjacent is 15. So which trig function will use hypotenuse and adjacent? So if you remember SOHCAHTOA, which one is it? Look at these first 2 letters. That would be H-A, H-O, not it. H-A. I'm pretty sure it's going to be cosine because tangent uses adjacent and opposite. So cosine. So cosine is what we're going to be using. Cosine is what we're using. All right, so let's set this up. Your formula says cosine of theta. In this case, theta is 57 degrees. Cosine of theta is equal to the, remember it was ka, adjacent over the hypotenuse. So the adjacent is going to be 15. The hypotenuse is x. We're just substituting values in. Cosine of 57 degrees is equal to 15 over x. And so now you just go ahead and solve this out. How do you solve this? I'm looking here. Since we have a fraction, we can cross multiply. So x gets multiplied by the cosine of 57 degrees. And 1 gets multiplied by 15. And so if we look, how do we solve this? If we have x times the cosine of 57, what's the opposite of multiplying by the cosine of 57? It is dividing by the cosine of 57 degrees. And so you divide both sides by the cosine of 57 degrees. We know that the cosine of 57 degrees cancels out on the left, so we're left with x is equal to. Now this is where you're going to type it into your calculator. If you're using a graphing calculator, you have to go into your mode setting and change, make sure it's set on degrees. You could be in radians, and that's going to give you a different answer than what we're looking for here. We're actually talking about degrees in our problem, so your mode has to be on degrees. All right, in your calculator, you should be typing 15 divided by cosine of 57 and pressing enter, and you should get something like 27.54. 27.54. So the value for the hypotenuse, 27.54. Okay, I'm going to erase the work here. I'm going to erase everything that we have. So let's look at now. We have to calculate for the opposite side, and we labeled that as y. So we're trying to find the opposite side, which is y. We know the adjacent side, which is 15, and I don't want to use the hypotenuse as 27.54 because it is a rounded, it is an approximation, it's a rounded answer there, so I want to use the exact 15 here. And which trig function we'll use? Those two? Well, we got to look at the first letters, O and A. Well, there's an O, but that takes the hypotenuse. It's not sine. There's the adjacent side, but there's the hypotenuse. We're looking for O and A. O for opposite, A for adjacent, so it's going to be tangent. So we're using tangent. So let's get rid of this and do some calculations. So we said we were using tangent, and using the formula, it says tangent of theta. In our case, theta is 57 degrees, so tangent of theta is equal to, it was TOA, so opposite over adjacent. Opposite is y, adjacent is 15. And you can think of it as a proportion again and cross multiply and divide, or you can just go back to what you know from algebra. You have to get y by itself. What's the opposite of dividing by 15? It's multiplying by 15, and the 15's cancel. And so if you multiply the right side by 15, you have to multiply the left side by 15. And so y is equal to 15 times the tangent of 57. 15 times the tangent of 57 should give you 23.097, and this 7 will round the 9 up. 23.1. 23.1. I'm going to go ahead and erase that work. If you need to pause the video to write it down. So the opposite is 23.1. So we know the hypotenuse, we know the opposite leg, we know the adjacent leg, so we have all the sides of the triangle. So we've met this part of it. Now we need to find all angle measures. Well, we know the right angle is 90. We know the other angle is 57. So all three angles should add up to equal 180. 180. But I know one of them is 90. So 90. So let's go ahead and do that. 180 minus 90. So that leaves us with 90. So the other two angles should add up to equal 90. And in right triangles, this will always be the case. The other two angles should always add up to equal 90 because one of them is already equal to 90. And so we subtract 57 from that. 33 degrees. So now you have all angle measures and all side measures. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. It says solve the triangle, find all side lengths and all angles. Let's go ahead and get started on that. First step, label the hypotenuse. So we have the hypotenuse. Second step, determine which angle we're going to be using. That's the one that we know is 45. And third step, label the opposite side, which is across from 45. And label the adjacent side, which is right next to it. Step number 3, figure out which trig function we're going to be using. So in order to do that, we have to figure out which side do we want to find first. Do you want to find the adjacent or the opposite? Let's go ahead and find the opposite side right now. We're going to call it x, and we'll call the adjacent y. So the opposite side, if we have theta is equal to 45. Theta is the angle, so theta is equal to 45 degrees. We're going to try and find the opposite side, which is x. We know the hypotenuse, which is 100. And so which trig function? Which trig function will we be using here? Oh, if you look at O and H is part of sine. Not AH, not OA. So we're using sine. So we're going to be using sine of theta. Theta in this case is 45. Sine of 45 degrees is equal to sine opposite over hypotenuse. So the opposite is x, and the hypotenuse is 100. And your fifth step would be to solve for the variable. This was step number 4 here. Step number 4 was substituting in. Step number 5 is solving. You're trying to get x by itself, so the opposite of dividing is multiplying by 100. Multiplying by 100. So go ahead and do that. 100 times sine of 45. Sine of 45 times 100 is going to be 70.71. And that's equal to x. So let's go ahead and write that up here. 70.71. Okay, well, you start putting on your thinking cap here, and you start to realize that if you have a 45-degree angle here and then a 90-degree angle, then this angle right here must be 45 also, because 45 degrees plus 45 degrees is 90, and plus this third 90, or the other 90, that's 100, or 180 degrees. So that's the interior angles of a triangle add up to equal 180. Now, if the base angles of a triangle are congruent, then you know that this triangle is an isosceles triangle. And if it's an isosceles triangle, you know that isosceles means that it has congruent sides. And so therefore, the adjacent leg is also x, which is 70.71. This only works because it's an isosceles triangle. Not all of them are going to be isosceles, but I want to throw one of these in there so you can pay attention to these things and use previous knowledge to solve these. The next one we have, if you look here, you have a fairly large triangle. So let's go ahead and get started. And step number 1 says label the hypotenuse, which is across from the right angle. Step number 2 says determine which angle you're going to be using, which is 25 degrees down here. You're using 25 degrees, so across from it, opposite of it would be the opposite side. And then right next to it is the adjacent side. Right next to it is the adjacent side. And so now we have to figure out which trig function we're going to be using. If we know the opposite is 64. What do you want to find, the adjacent or the hypotenuse? Okay, we'll find the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is going to be, I'm labeling it at x. And theta. Theta, 25 degrees. So which trig function is going to use the opposite and the hypotenuse? Opposite, hypotenuse. We don't need that. Opposite and hypotenuse. Not this one, not this one. Opposite, hypotenuse. Right there at B. So we say the sine of theta, which is 25 degrees, is equal to opposite over the hypotenuse. And you have it set up, so now you go ahead and solve it out. Since x is on the bottom, you should probably think about cross multiplying x times the sine of 25 degrees. And remember, it's the sine of 25 degrees, not 25. And 1 gets multiplied by 64 to make 64. So if we're multiplying x by the sine of 25 degrees, we have to divide x by the sine of 25 degrees. Cancel them out. And if we divide the left side by the sine of 25, we have to divide the right side by the sine of 25 degrees. So therefore, x is equal to, type that in your calculator and figure out what it is. You should be practicing typing it in the calculator to figure out these answers. I'd assume if you're watching this on the computer has a calculator, and it should be able to do that for you. You may have to go up to like options or view and change it to a scientific calculator in order to get the trig functions. It was 151.436, but that 6 will round the 3 up to a 4. So the 6 will round the 3 up to a 4. So 151.44 is what we're writing that down there. Let's go ahead and get rid of our work. And now let's go ahead and find the adjacent side. If we're trying to find the adjacent side, and we know the opposite side, which trig function is that going to use? So, ka, toa. A and O. That has an O, but it doesn't have an A. Ka has an A, but it doesn't have an O. Toa has an O and an A. So it's going to be toa. So we're going to use toa, so which is going to be tangent. So we say the tangent, put a line here, the tangent of theta. Theta is 25 degrees. Tangent of theta is equal to opposite, which in our case is 64, over the adjacent, which is y. And go ahead and work this out. Y is going to be multiplied by the tangent of 25, and 1 gets multiplied by 64. And what's the opposite of multiplying by the tangent of 25? It would be dividing by the tangent of 25 degrees. Cancels out on the left, and you have to also divide by the tangent of 25 degrees on the right. So y is equal to 64 divided by the tangent of 25 degrees. And you should get 137.248. The 8 will round the 4 up to a 5. So adjacent will be 137.25. So now we have all the side measurements. Now we need to find the third angle measurement. And that third angle measurement can be found. We know that since we have a 90-degree angle, the other two angles must add up to equal 90. So subtract those, and you should get 65. You subtract the theta, which was 25, and you subtract it from 90, you get 65. So this third angle up here, 65 degrees. 65 degrees. I think we got one more problem here. This one says solve the triangle, find all sides and all angles. Well, we know that this is going to be the hypotenuse. Since theta is 40 degrees, the side across from it is opposite, and the side next to it is adjacent. I always get stuck in the habit of using X and Y, so let me use A and B this time. That way we can use some different letters. So if we look here, let's go ahead and figure out, what do you want to calculate first? Do you want to calculate the opposite side or the adjacent side? Let's go with the opposite side first. So we know the opposite side is letter A. We have the hypotenuse. We know what its measurement is. And we know theta is 40. So we're trying to figure out which trig function we will be using. So O and H. There's O and H. So we're probably using sine, because this needs, cosine needs the adjacent, and tangent also needs the adjacent leg. So we're going to be using sine in this case. So we'll say sine of theta, which is 40 degrees. Sine of theta. That's equal to the opposite of the hypotenuse, Opposite is A. Hypotenuse is 28. So from here, and you notice that every single time we've done one of these problems, we've always had one variable in the problem. If we were to do tangent of 40 degrees is equal to opposite over adjacent. Opposite is A, adjacent is B, and we have two variables. You can't solve a problem with two variables, two unknowns in there. You need a problem with one unknown. So make sure when you're setting these up, you're always using a side that you know in your calculations. Alrighty then, let's go ahead and wrap this up. The opposite of dividing by 28 is multiplying by 28. So if you multiply the right side by 28, you have to multiply the left side by 28. So A is equal to 28 times the sine of 40, and 28 times the sine of 40. $17.998. So we're going to have the 8 round the 9 up, and if it rounds it up, then it's going to round this up, and it'll also round that up. So we can't just put 18 there because it's not exactly 18. We need to put 18.0 to show that this is a rounded answer. So we're going to put 18.0 as the opposite side. 18.0. Let me go ahead and erase some of this work. Alright, now we need to find the adjacent side. So we need to calculate adjacent, which is B. We know the hypotenuse, which is 28, and which trig function are we going to be using? Trig function. So we're looking at A and H. Well, this needs sine, needs the opposite, and tangent also needs the opposite. Cosine uses the adjacent and the hypotenuse, and that's the one we're using. Cosine is the one we're going to be using. So let's go ahead and set this up. We say cosine of theta. Theta is 40 degrees. And that's equal to adjacent goes on top, which is B. Hypotenuse goes on bottom, which is 28. The opposite of dividing by 28 is multiplying by 28. And those cancel. If you multiply the right side by 28, you also have to multiply the left side by 28. And so now B is equal to 28 times the cosine of 40 degrees. And this gives you an answer of 21.449. The 9 rounds the 4 up to a 5. So the adjacent is 21.45. We know since we have a right triangle that the other two angles must add up to equal 90. So we subtract 40 from 90 and we get 50, and that's the third angle measurement there, 50 degrees. So you've calculated all sides and all angles, and you've solved that right triangle. That'll be the end of the video. If you have any questions, let me know.